Okay, good evening, everyone. Hopefully you are all in the room now. We are about to start. Jon is going to his second session on this topic of COVID-19 versus your insurance policy. And he will be starting shortly. In the meantime, if you have any questions, there's a chat box to the right of the screen. Please feel free to submit these questions. Jon will endeavour to answer as many as possible. As we've said previously, we will take a note of all the questions that have been asked and get the answers to them and make them available via the website resource page as normal. We will also be releasing some details shortly of additional seminars, so keep an eye out for those. Okay, Jon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Good evening, everyone. I do find this slightly disconcerting. I do hope that people are listening out there, and I do trust that you're all safe and well. In particular, I do hope my daughter Katie, who's doing her LPC, is safe and well as well. Hello, Katie. We're going to have a quick look at COVID-19 and the insurers' response. I'll tell you which slide we're on as we go through, though hopefully it should be fairly self-explanatory. So from slide 1, which is the what I'm going to talk about slide, if you turn over the page, there's a lovely picture of me. You don't really need to know much about that, apart from the fact that I've been working in and around the insurance industry for the last 32 years. So I hope I speak with a certain amount of authority on the subject. Over the page again, there are some caveats. I wouldn't be a lawyer if I didn't have some caveats. And so this seminar addresses insurance issues generally. Everybody's insurance policy differs, and more about that later. This seminar is as accurate as it can be given the rapidly changing situation. Unfortunately, I cannot address specific situations. Obviously, very happy to outside of this seminar, but you should be speaking to your broker, your lawyer, or other advisor. Over the page again, I'll have a quick run through, please, if I may, of the agenda. We're going to have a look at whether this is an act of God. We'll have a quick look at the general information about the virus, office policies, force majeure, frustration, the insurance market's current approach, mitigation, and then I thought I'd quickly touch on travel insurance simply because it affects everyone at the moment, and just some tips in that direction. So then over the page, act of God. Certainly when the coronavirus first started, there was much speculation in the press as to whether this would be an act of God. I can assure you categorically that no court in any jurisdiction will regard this virus outbreak as an act of God. There's two possible causes for this outbreak. One, consumption by humans of animals outside the normal food chain. Certain parts of China, they tend to do this and they're not necessarily cooked well, and therefore the common theory is that somehow a virus crossed across the food chain. Secondly, as is always the case in these situations, there is a conspiracy theory. Wuhan had a Pirbright. Pirbright here holds the original stock of viruses, so it has the original smallpox virus. You need to have the original so that when viruses slightly mutate, you've got something to compare them against, and hopefully then come up with a quicker cure. But obviously, places can be misused, and obviously they're very dangerous places. It's perfectly possible that there was a leak or an outbreak from there. But whichever theory you subscribe to, and if you turn over the page, the current law, and this applies in just about every jurisdiction, is set out by the decision of Lord Hobson in a case called Transco PLC and Stockport Metropolitan Council, which is reported at 2003 UK HL 61. Lord Hobson described an act of God as an event which A, involves no human agency, is not realistically possible to guard against, is due directly and exclusively to natural causes, and could not have been prevented by any amount of foresight, plans, and care. Clearly, this virus falls outside those parameters. Next slide. What's known about the virus? Well, very little. That's why everyone's struggling to find a cure for it promptly. It seems not to react well to heat, but only in some jurisdictions. Alcohol, it seems not to react well to that again, but that depends on where you are. And governments in various jurisdictions have taken measures to counteract the virus, but they all follow the same consistent approach. The first one being containment, the second one, and we're very much now in the delay phase, so I won't repeat what's going on at the moment. And then obviously in the background, mitigation or a cure is going on, so hopefully in 6 to 8 months' time, which seems to be the realistic time scale, there will be some form of cure. Now, turning to your insurance policies, I want to stress this very clearly because it still arises whether you're dealing with individuals or with companies. You will have been sent by your insurance broker, or if you've gone direct, by your direct service provider, a cover note. Now, an example of the cover note is on the next slide. It's headed, surprisingly enough, example of cover note. In fact, it's our office policy. And you will see there that there is various categories of cover defined, and next to it is an amount that the insurance company will pay in relation to that particular aspect of cover. All well and good. It gives you an accurate summary of what you potentially have insurance coverage for. But over the page, headed example of policy, is a policy wording. Now, this is a much more detailed document. If I say to you that the cover note on the previous page was no more than 4 pages long, and if I tell you that the policy wording is something like 60 pages long, then I hope you understand the difference, because it's important that you do understand the difference. Your cover note over the page, next slide, your cover note only identifies the main terms of your policy. It is not your contract with your insurance company. The policy wording, this is your contract with your insurance company, and it needs careful reading by the responsible officer in your company to ensure that it meets your company's requirements, or indeed your own individual requirements. Now, you can obtain your policy wording from your broker or from your direct provider, but it will be a lengthy document, and it will clearly say it's your policy wording. This is the document that contains exclusions, restrictions, excesses that apply to your policy. This is the document that courts in all jurisdictions look at to determine the level and extent of your insurance coverage. In a case called Kuwait Airways and Kuwait Insurance Company in 1990, which dealt with Kuwait Airways losses as a result of the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein, there was no policy wording agreed for the Kuwait Airways account for that year, but the courts relied on the previous year's policy wording. Such is the importance that courts attach to policy wordings. So if your business changes in a way throughout the year, in any way throughout the year, including taking on new or unusual types of work, you need to update your underwriters. Your policy wording, if you like, is a living document throughout any insurance year. I thought then I'd quickly look at office policies, because no matter what industry you're in, but particularly in the construction industry, that normally there is an office where complex plans are drawn up, where people who are not on site work on a day-to-day basis. So you need to know in these times whether or not you may, and I stress may because I shall return to this point later, have cover. So is there cover if you need to leave your offices? Well, there's two types of cover that apply to your offices. There's what's called passive cover and what's called intervention cover. Passive cover is normally an extension bought on your office policy, because most office policies normally only cover intervention cover. Intervention means something physical. So a flood, a fire, in the old days, an act of terrorism where your windows come in. That is normally what your office policy will cover. It does not cover passive events. So a classic example is a major gas leak outside your building and you all have to leave the building for a period of 2 weeks whilst it's fixed. That's not normally covered in your office policy. Similarly, 2 suspicious vehicles are parked near your offices. It takes 4 or 5 days to deal with them. There's no physical damage to your property at all, or to your offices. What there is, though, is a risk that there might be, and you have to leave your offices for 7 or so days. So make sure and check your policy that you've got both intervention and passive cover. As with all types of policies, there will be limits on the policy as to how much you can recover, and you will also still have to prove your loss, that actually by leaving your offices, you did suffer some loss. Next slide, I'm going to briefly touch on force majeure. Without a shadow of a doubt, coronavirus is likely to cause delay to contractual obligations. If a contract contains a force majeure clause, this excuses one or both parties from performance of the contract if certain defined events occur. Now, force majeure has no fixed interpretation in English law, so each case will be individually considered by the courts unless the circumstances are specifically set out within the force majeure clause. Businesses who think they may be affected by the pandemic should check the force majeure clause to see if it covers the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Now, going forward, let's all try and remember what's happened in relation to this virus. Business will resume, maybe 3 months' time, 6 months' time, 8 months' time, a year's time. But when entering into new contracts going forward, you should seriously consider whether to include a force majeure clause appropriate to the type of business locations within which you're going to operate, so that you can possibly make specific reference to pandemics and to epidemics. The clause should also include potential government action, such as we've seen at the moment, reacting to outbreaks such as quarantine measures in large cities, and the closure of public transport, which might prevent a company's employees from working and thus prevent the performance of the parties' obligations. So think going forward when you're entering into new contracts whether it's appropriate to insert a force majeure clause which clearly defines the events that will give rise to force majeure. The next thing to look at is the doctrine of frustration. Now, where there is no applicable force majeure clause in the contract, another avenue might be to invoke the doctrine of frustration. This doctrine says that a contract may be brought to an end where something unforeseen occurs after the formation of the contract, through no fault of either party, that is the effect of making it commercially or physically impossible to perform the contract. Now, whilst it might be possible to argue that the pandemic has frustrated the contract, the courts are often unwilling to find that a contract has been frustrated. This is a remedy that you can only seek from the court. The main problem with frustration is that it terminates the contract permanently. Both parties are excused from the contract. Now, my advice would not be to go to the courts and seek a ruling that the contract has been frustrated. It is better in these times, which everyone is suffering from, to try and negotiate time extensions, etc., with your opposite party. So typically, I would have thought at the moment, 3 months extensions on all contracts, including penalty clauses, would be something that should be reasonably and successfully negotiated without having to go to court, because only the court can determine whether a contract has been frustrated or not. So it would be much better if, when you're drafting your new contracts, that you put in a force majeure clause which specifically refers to events such as pandemics, rather than trying to use general law principles such as the doctrine of frustration. So let's look at the insurance market current approach. This is the next slide, and it's headed Insurance Market Approach. So is the insurance market going to come running to all of our aid in our time of need? Well, possibly, but the better principle is to work on the basis that, frankly, it won't. This may not come as a surprise to a lot of you. The first thing, though, you need to work out is what potential cover you have in respect of delay and cancellation of contracts, and as I've said, having to abandon offices, building sites, etc. So the policies that you need to look at are, firstly, business interruption clauses in any of your insurance contracts, but they will be subject to specific terms which you will find in your policy wording. Is there cover for delay of essential supplies? I spoke to our insurance broker, Clear, and you can place a policy that would cover that, but it's an unusual policy, but that's not to say that some of you may not have it. If you have it, you're fortunate, and therefore you should look at its terms and conditions. Look at your contractor's all-risk cover. What does that say about delay in receipt of essential supplies? What does it say about delay? And what does it say about business interruption? And as I've said, also look at your office exclusion cover. I then have a heading which says, what will assist? Well, the fact that coronavirus has now been declared a pandemic and a notifiable disease at first seemed to be helpful. But unfortunately, Mr. Johnson didn't do his homework very well. Those of you old enough to remember will remember there was a thing called SARS between 2003 and 2005. Everyone thought then this was going to be a pandemic. This had the effect of waking insurers up. So they looked at their policies to see, oh, well, I think we better put some exclusions in here. And the most common exclusion was that they would only pay for losses if it was a notifiable disease. But you're saying to me, John, well, this is a notifiable disease now. Well, yes, it is. But unfortunately, in most insurance policies, they list what are notifiable diseases that they are prepared to cover. Surprisingly enough, because coronavirus 19 was unheard of, it's not on that list, and therefore insurers are not going to provide coverage. Some just say notifiable diseases. Well, insurers' approach to that is, well, that's okay, this is a notifiable disease, but at the time you took out your policy, I didn't know about it, you didn't know about it, and we didn't charge any premium to cover this virus, therefore excluding it from the policy. Now, insurers' position seems to be at the moment that anything related to coronavirus 19 is excluded from the policy. That will also include your office policy. However, some insurers, well, one, Hiscox, are taking a more sensible approach, and they're saying that if your office has had to close as a result of government action, then they will pay up to 100,000 over 3 months, subject to you actually being able to prove that you have suffered that loss. Now, it's to be hoped that the government will put pressure on the insurance industry to start to change their position on this and to start being more proactive in terms of paying claims arising out of this coronavirus. Boris is already not very happy with the banks for not passing on interest rate cuts, and he'll be less than happy with the insurance market turning around and saying, sorry, we're not paying anything. Coronavirus is simply not covered. But the reality of this situation at the moment, and I appreciate this is not good news for anyone, is that the insurance market are seeking to exclude any liability for any losses on any type of policy as a result of the coronavirus. So, as I say, insurers are arguing that this outbreak is not within the reasonable contemplation of either party when the insurance cover was taken out, and unless you took out your policy probably before January the 20th, Wuhan going into lockdown on January the 23rd, the chances are that your insurance company now has specifically excluded cover for Corona-19, and indeed will be beefing up the definitions of viruses, pandemics, notifiable diseases in just about every new insurance contract. So even if you are lucky enough to have cover and you've had a policy that incepted before January the 20th, you're still going to have an uphill fight to recover any money from your insurance companies. Now, there will be test cases on this, I am quite sure, and it may be that the courts will find that they're not with the insurance companies, but that doesn't help anyone practically at the moment. The position the insurance market is adopting is that just about anything related to coronavirus is excluded and there will be no cover. As I said, it's to be hoped that the government put pressure on the insurance industry to try, at least, to get some cover. But even if you are fortunate enough, and I'm on the next slide now, mitigation, to have policies that include some type of cover for pandemic and notifiable diseases, then you still have an overriding duty to mitigate your loss. This means that you must not just close your office and walk away, even if you have cover for passive office insurance. You must wait until the government says you must close your office before you actually do so. In terms of business interruption, you must still continue to operate your business to the best of your ability. Cannot just simply say, we're covered, therefore we're shutting up shop, nothing to worry about. That's not how it works. You must continue to operate your business to the very best of your ability in order to minimize the claim that you may be able to make on your insurance policy. A reminder about notification. In all insurance policies, and this has not been changed by the recent Insurance Act of 2015, you must inform your insurers as soon as possible that you might be making a claim. Now, at this stage, it is probably too early to make claims in your business interruption policy. You will need to be able to substantiate the fact that your business has suffered loss as a result of business interruption, and you will need at least a month or two's figures in order to be able to clearly demonstrate this to insurers. Lastly, and I cannot stress this enough, you need to communicate continually with your brokers to ask them what you should be doing in the current circumstances. Be guided by their advice as to what you can claim for and when you should be claiming it, and when you should be notifying insurers as to the potential claims. It is going to be an uphill struggle as it is, and the last thing you want is insurers raising a defence of late notification. Lastly, a word on travel insurance, because this affects us all. Some people travel on business and there may be a business policy that covers them for travel. And of course, many of us have personal travel policies. Again, unless you took out your company policy to cover employees traveling or your own personal policy before 16th, 20th of January, you'll probably now find that no travel policy will cover cancellation or delay as a result of the coronavirus. It will be specifically excluded. Not that, quite frankly, though, anyone can go anywhere at the moment, but there we are. But if you are fortunate to have a travel policy which you took out before the coronavirus pandemic hit, do not, under any circumstances, voluntarily cancel your holiday, flights, etc. Wait until the airline has cancelled your flight, and wait until the government advice from the FCO recommends not travelling to your particular destination. Do not do anything voluntarily, because insurers will say that it was your decision to cancel and not something you were forced to do by the United Kingdom government, in particular the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Ladies and gentlemen, I do hope that that has been of some use to you all. I'm afraid I cannot give at this moment better news, but as I've said, it is important that you keep in contact with your professional advisors with regard to your insurance cover, and in particular with regard to your brokers. Brokers vary in ability, but certainly those of you who have London brokers, they will be able to advise you in some detail as to what steps you should be taking, in particular with regard to whether or not possibly you need to be making preliminary notifications of potential claims. Thank you very much, and I do hope that everyone stays safe wherever they may be. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Do we have any questions for John? If you can't think of anything now, as I said earlier, please feel free to email us. We'll do our best to answer those. And as and when updates become available in terms of insurance and in terms of contracts generally with regard to COVID and further government advice or action, we will run a series of update seminars. Other than that, thank you all very much for tuning in, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you for your time.